Museum Windsor for inviting Reverend Lotz to speak to you on his 20-year investment in researching the lives, if I get a little emotional, bear with me, of 1,300 veterans from Windsor and Essex County who lived in your neighborhoods, who attended your schools, who worked in our offices, who lived and worked on the farms. And when the call to arms was made, they had no second thought in putting down their shovel, getting off their tractor, and saying to mom and dad, this is it, I'm out of here, I gotta do what I gotta do. When Jean first approached me to read the first few manuscripts, I said, piece of cake. I'm a writer, piece of cake. Boy, did I get a major wake-up call. 3 o'clock in the morning, reading about a 17-year-old lad, didn't even know how to drive a tractor. Yeah, landed on Dieppe, and that's where he stayed. So Jean has invested 20 years as a historian and author and a padre. His speaking strategy is quite moving. So the Anguish War shines the light on the lives of many who took up the cause. You know, they rallied to the colors. Many were in our neighborhoods, in our schools, in our factories. They were employed in offices and pharmacies. They were doctors and lawyers. And they knew that it was the right thing to do. They didn't question it, to follow in the footstep of a generation that was before them. 2 generations, actually. So, from cover to cover, and then this is the cover, the Anguish War brings a deep human dimension to capture the stains and strains of war. In battle, in hospitals, and at home, because many suffered when they came back home. It just wasn't on the field. Also when they came home, the dark shadows, what they call the dark dog, followed them on the way home. So lives were lost or forever changed. The Anguish of War gets to the heart of the matter, and with a shared connection to many of our veterans who never doubted that they were doing the right thing for all the right reasons. This sets in place an understanding of how and why so many gave up a piece of their individuality to become a part of something larger than themselves. In the book, you will read acknowledgement from, of course, Reverend Lotz and Teresa Charbonneau, our Silver Cross Medal, because in Jean's book, Jean does, mention the Silver Cross mothers that lost their sons, and also made presentations in Ottawa for Remembrance Day. So there is that generational connection to family, and when Reverend Lotz approached Mrs. Charbonneau, without hesitation, she did the preface in honor of all veterans and more so of her son. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Reverend Jean Lotz, if he hasn't fallen asleep.
Glad to be here this evening. Some of you may be wondering what happened to my foot. I just wanted to share with you that this is the latest in men's footwear, right out of New York City, Paris, and England.
It's not a war wound.
No, it's not. This is the latest footwear fashion for men. And you can tell your children and your grandchildren that you first saw it here this evening.
Thanks to Amazon.
I thought you stopped on his foot, really.
No.
I wanted to share with you the Anguish of War book I wrote, and it came out just before Remembrance Day. And originally, back in the late 1990s, I was invited to be a chairperson of a committee to build a war memorial in Malden Park, a Masonic War Memorial. And I agreed to that. Well, I had to come up with, well, whose names are going to be on these? Well, I had to find out all the people that died locally from the Masonic fraternity and all the people that died during the wars. That list is not out there. So I had to read the newspapers right through all the war years and beyond, World War I, Boer War, World War II, Korean War, down at the university every night, reading through microfilm and photocopying obituaries as I found them. Then I went to every cemetery, every school, every church in Essex County. They all have rolls of honor on the walls, so I take down the names from there. I came up with this list, over 1,300 names. I couldn't believe there were that many names from that were killed during times of war. So we built the war memorial, and the first stab at getting this published was with a group, and we put it on the internet. The internet was newer than it is today, and that's the way to go. Well, a couple of years of working on that, it came to nothing. So I worked on it off and on for the next 10 years, and finally, after 2 heart attacks, I figured, I better do something. My number's somewhere, so time to do something. And I wrote the book. Andrea was the first one outside of my wife Kathy that saw it. Originally it was 1,500 pages, 5 volumes. That thick. And Andrea mentioned this to a gentleman in Windsor, Herb Calling. You may have heard of him. And he came and I gave him the first volume. Have a look. Tell me what you think. Well, he came back about a week later, and he had edited the first 50 pages. And I read it, and I goes, well, does this mean you're going to be my editor? He goes, yeah. So we spent the next year. I love Herb, God bless Herb, but we did run into loggerheads with one another as a creative person and as a guy that was taking a 5-volume, 1,500-page book and condensing it down with all the pertinent information still there. Okay, that's a task, and he did a good job. I'm very happy. There were moments where we didn't agree, but we had to work it out. We worked together. We worked together very well. So when we were in the final work of the book, we had a woman help set up the graphics of the book. And she said to me, gee, this sounds like a really nice book. Do you mind if I read it? I said, no, read it. Let me know what you think. So about a week later, I bumped into him. I said, well, did you have a chance to read it? He said, well, I read some of it, and I just can't read it. It's too sad. I'm going to let you in on a little secret. It's supposed to be sad. There's 1,300 young men and women who were killed in the prime of their life. This book is not like a John Wayne movie where the tough guy faces a whole other enemy army, kills half of them, and in the end gets a wound in the arm. He gets the medal, and he gets the girl. This isn't Hollywood. These people lived in our communities. They were part of our communities. They were farmers, machinists, milkmen, postal workers, firefighters, you name it. They were part of our community, and they went off to war. They put them in harm's way, put themselves in harm's way, believing in something. And they knew that specifically in the Second World War that there was a lot of fascism in the world. And they didn't like that, and they were going to do something about it. And off they went to put themselves in harm's way. Now, the book starts with a gentleman, his name was Walter White. And he was a native individual up by Sarnia who moved down to Windsor as a child, grew up here, and he went off and fought in the Boer War, South Africa, turn of the century, 1899, 1902. And he was killed during the Battle of Paardeberg. He was killed during the battle taking water to another wounded soldier on the battlefield. Bullets flying over their heads, and he was shot in the head. And there's a story, I'm writing a new book, I'll talk about that later, about the soldier that crawled out to him and dragged his body back after the battle and buried it. He was 19 years old. And then it goes right through to Andrew Drennan, Teresa's son, who was killed in Afghanistan. So between those two dates, 1,500 people. Now there are men and women in this book that were killed. One of the women was a young girl from Windsor, enlisted in the Canadian Army Women's Corps, went to England. They would work in decoding things and intelligence and very, very important work. Well, she met a young man from Regina. They got married. The war was in its very last week, and they went to Holland for their honeymoon. It had already been liberated, and they got in a car accident, and both of them were killed. They are the only married couple buried together in a Canadian war cemetery in the world. And she came from Windsor. And the stories are so vivid and real and almost surreal to what we enjoy in life. And a lot of the liberties that we have were fought for and paid for with their blood. So that's what the book is about, trying to put a face to those people, putting a life to who they were and what they did. We know what they did, but who were they? What did they do? And that's what I've tried to portray in the book, that there were lives. They loved their mothers, their brothers and sisters. They loved their community. They loved their church. And they put that all on the back burner and went and fought. And one of the stories, the Second World Story, now this gentleman that I wrote about, he was interviewed in Windsor after the war. Actually, it was during the war. And he was a merchant mariner. He worked on a convoy on a ship. And the Canadian Navy during the Second World War was instrumental in guarding the convoys that would go to Europe that kept England alive before the liberation of Europe. And he was on a boat and off of Newfoundland. They were by themselves and it was torpedoed. It went down in a matter of minutes. There were 32 sailors on the boat, and all 32 got into two lifeboats, 16 in one, 16 into the other. And the one lifeboat went off one side of the boat, the other lifeboat went off the other side of the boat. That lifeboat was never seen again. So there were 16 boys left. And the first day out in the ocean, they sang songs and told stories and joked and kibitzed. And this was in January in the North Atlantic. And they said, oh, it's just a matter of, today or tomorrow they'll be here to rescue us. Well, the next day came and nobody came. And their spirits were a little damp, but they carried on. They knew they had to, they told funny stories and pat each other on the back. Well, the third morning when they woke up, 2 had passed away. And they had a funeral service for them and buried them at sea. And carried on, hoping that this is the third day. They're hoping, they're going to be here. They're going to come and rescue us. Well, the next day, 3 more passed away. And by this time, it was 4 days. They'd been out in the North Atlantic in the middle of January. They didn't have the strength to get the bodies out of the boat. The next day, a couple more died. On the 6th day, there were only 5 left, I'm sorry. They couldn't get up. That day it snowed, and they were all covered, the living and the dead were covered with a white shroud. And this young boy told the story of the joy that he felt when he opened his eyes and there was a Canadian destroyer next to their lifeboat. And 5 of them were saved out of the 32. And the curious thing about that is that there was one sailor that got in the boat, in the life raft, without his shoes on. He was the only one that didn't have to have his feet amputated because of the frostbite. All the others had their feet amputated. And they interviewed this young man. He was on his honeymoon in Windsor with his new bride, and they asked him, what did you think? And he said, the only thing I wish is that I could do more. Wow is right. This is the great generation that we're talking about here. Wow, that I wish I could do more. And it's just so moving and powerful that the strength of spirit of these young people in difficult times is something we can't really appreciate because we're not in that situation. There was another story. Not all the stories that are in the book are about military war dead. I did include some civilians. This one was a mother and daughter. The husband enlisted in the Canadian Army. He was stationed in England. The mother and daughter followed him there. 14-year-old daughter. And they were working in an armament factory. And that evening they were living in a tenement house. It was hit with a V2 rocket, and they were both killed. 14-year-old girl. Humanity. He survived the war, which is, it's just incredible. And the stories, DF, we know about DF in Windsor. Well, do we know the names, the faces of the people? Yeah, we know that a lot of Windsorites were killed that day. You bet there were a lot of Windsorites killed. The city was flabbergasted. The crazy thing was that they did a news blackout. The news was so bad that they did a news blackout. Well, doing news blackout in Windsor is like, there was no news blackout over in Detroit. So they got all the news, and that became a big thing in Windsor is, well, where did they get their news about D-Day? They got it over in Detroit about what happened. And anybody here knows Morris Snook?
I know of him.
No, I knew him. He was a wonderful man. He was at Dieppe. And one of the soldiers I wrote about, who's in the book, was a dentist from Windsor that died on the beaches of Dieppe. How on earth did a dentist from Windsor end up on the beaches of Dieppe? He may have been a dentist, but at heart he was a soldier, and he wanted to do something about fascism, and he ended up on the beaches of Dieppe. And Maurice told me that he was shot in the head with a shell, so it took his whole head off. And Maurice told this to me. I witnessed it, and he got choked up. And how these events could, in later life, 40 years after it happened, still bring a person to tears who saw it. It's just incredible. Now, some of the battles in the First World War were horrendous, but in our history, we learn about Vimy Ridge. That's the big one, Vimy Ridge. Yeah, it was a victory, and everybody's happy, and Canada won, and raw for the country. But there were so many other battles. Courcelette. There were so many young Windsor boys that were shot and killed at Courcelette. There's a cemetery in France. It's called the Sunken Road Cemetery. And there's two little cemeteries. It's off in a farmer's field. And there's only a dirt path going to it. Out in the field, there's a little cemetery with about 48 graves in it. And that would have been where a field hospital was located during the war. And when the soldiers died, they buried them very closely by. Well, there's little cemeteries out in the field. Well, that cemetery contains 48 graves. It contains the grave of 6 boys from Windsor. Now, that's a high percentage of local boys to be in one cemetery. It is the highest percentage in any cemetery, in Canadian cemetery in the world, is this little one. And it's out in the middle of a farmer's field. It is such a special place for every Windsorite to realize it, but nobody knows the Sunken Road Cemetery. But that's an important part of our life, an important part of our history, of the military history, is that road. Now there was a young soldier, I'm bouncing around a little bit, during the First World War, Mother's Day. I don't know how many of you are mothers, but during the First World War there was a young soldier, and it was the spring, and I've seen this in the Boer War, World War I, World War II, where spring comes, and they're often mentioned in letters home that the birds have come back, and the spring was here, and the world was starting to renew itself. There was in the First World War, we think of no man's land, of the mud and death and barbed wire and craters and terrible places. Well, in the spring, the flowers would start blooming, and the grass would try and grow back, and the birds would come back. And it was, this soldier rode home, and he was telling his parents about this scene, and he decided, I'm going to send my mom some flowers for Mother's Day. So in the middle of the night, he crawled up out of the parapet, out into no man's land, and he found some flowers. He cut them and he brought them back, and he dried them out and sent them to his mother for Mother's Day. And the day before she got it, she got a letter from the army that he'd been killed in action.
Oh, no.
And his final resting place is known but to God. The humanity. And there's another story about a young Windsor, a young Windsor man, young Windsor boy, that he was on guard duty in the trenches, and he had to go to the bathroom. And the latrines were far away, so he asked his sergeant, he said, well, look, there's a crater just over there. Just go over in the crater. I'll wait here for you. Just go over in the crater. Well, during the First World War, craters, some of the craters were so big that they named them. There was a Montreal crater that was huge, a Regina crater. So he crawled out and went to the crater and did his business. He came back and he was stopped by the sentry. What's the password? And he said, it's okay, it's me. Well, that wasn't the password.
Oh, no.
And he shot him.
Oh,
And then he was killed. War is what can I say? In the book, I tried to, you've hummed and hawed, there's a life there. A life that mattered. A life that was important to a lot of people. It was a life worth living. And all that they put on the line. During the Second World War, there was who's heard of the Halifax explosion? There's a munition ship in Halifax Harbor. They collided with another munition ship. They blew up. Half of Halifax was destroyed during the First World War. Well, during the Second World War, a similar event took place where there was an ammunition ship was on fire out in the harbor. Now, this would have been recent memory because the Halifax explosion only happened 23 years earlier. So there were probably people around that, this was a big deal. Well, what was the Canadian Navy response? They sent out a ship to sink it before it blew up. Now, imagine the courage of those individuals on that ship going out and trying to sink an ammunition ship that's on fire in the harbor. Wow. And they did it. They succeeded. The ship was sunk. What is the value? What is the cost of a city? They saved a city. Well, there was a cost that day. There was one young sailor who was knocked overboard and drowned. And he was from Windsor. That was the price that was paid that day to save a city. So when we think of these individuals' lives, they did more than save a city. They saved a country. They saved a world. And it's important for every one of us to remember that, to be respectful, to be considered, to think about it. And that's why once a year we celebrate Remembrance Day. And we celebrate it, and we do a good job celebrating it, but it's something remembrance should be part of our lives if we really want to remember. I'm in the final process of writing another book, and it's going to be called Faces of a Forgotten War. Windsor, Essex County, Canada, and the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. And I wanted to share one story from that book. I mean, there are numerous ones, but one sticks in my heart. As a man of God, it speaks volumes to me, and it speaks of the courage of these young men. It was happened during the Battle of Hart's Creek. Now, the battles they had in the Boer War were very intense. There was artillery and gunfire, but not on the scale we saw in the First World War. It was just a warm-up for the First World War. Young soldier, he was from Ontario, and he was shot in the stomach, and he fell off his horse, and another soldier came to him, and he lied next to him, and the soldier promised to write his parents and tell them what happened to him. And that's where he got the letter about his soldier's final moments. And oh, thank you. So this young soldier came to this other soldier. He asked him, "Can you pull up my jacket and see how bad it is?" So he pulled up his jacket, and the soldier looked at it, and he said, "I'm sorry, it's hopeless." And the soldier said to him, "What's going to happen to me?" And the other young soldier said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And the soldier said, "Yes, I do." And he said, "Then you have nothing to worry about." He said to him, "Can you please tell my parents that I died bravely?" And then his final words, the soldier said, "Can I help? Can I do anything else for him?" And he answered him, "Can you hold me?" And he held them tight as the bullets whizzed over their heads, and he passed away. That human compassion, human touch, it just spoke volumes to me, how much we mean to one another, and how much that touch can mean to us. And these are powerful stories. If this doesn't pull at your heart, I'm just so moved by some of the stories. I mean, I could go on and on. I'm very excited about the new book that I'm working on. It just seems that letter writing during the Anglo-Boer War, there was a lot more of it. It seems during the Second World War that it was censored. There was, where back earlier, there was no censorship. It was written, published in the newspaper of the day, and you could read about what was going on in these soldiers' lives. And I find that fascinating. I have to, with the new book, I have to struggle with, this was an imperialist war. I have to struggle with that. You can't put 21st century ethics and apply it to 120 years ago. That's not fair. So to try and understand and see what these young soldiers, for a lot of reasons, they loved their country, and they loved the freedom that they had. And what they wanted to do was try and show that freedom to other countries. Maybe we don't get that today, but that's really what they were trying to do. They thought that as long as once we win this war, then they'll understand the good that we've done them. Well, I don't know if that's true, but that's what they were trying to do. And that aside, the politics of the day aside, the humanity that was there is just so important. And I hope that that's come out in my book, the humanity. That's what's important. That's something that every one of us share with one another. It's something that brings us together as beings. And unfortunately, it's something that divides us to get apart and causes wars. And war is the absolute worst thing that we can inflict on one another. But that seems to be part of the human situation. And my book, I hope, puts a face and a life and a love. I was so thankful that Teresa Charbonneau wrote the foreword for the second volume. I write a little bit about Silver Cross mothers. That was started after the First World War. They didn't give out Silver Crosses during the Boer War. They gave them out after the First World War. During the First World War, there was one woman from Windsor who lost 3 sons. During the Second World War, there were 3 women that lost 3 sons. One of the women went on to do great things. She met with the Pope. And when she was in Italy meeting the Pope, one of her sons had been killed in Italy. He was about 40, 50 miles away, buried in a Canadian War Cemetery. And they asked her, "Do you want to go see your son's grave?" She said no. She couldn't bear it. And some of the mothers, they did so much to remember not just their sons, soldiers, her sons' comrades. That's what it was all about. And the sad thing is, one of the mothers didn't have a happy ending. And I don't know what to say. There's part of war. Breaks our heart, breaks our souls. And I know after the First World War, today we call it post-traumatic stress disorder. It was common after the Second World War where there were a lot of suicides. Mm-hmm. Even after the Boer War, there was one soldier that came back and killed himself. So this war is a nasty thing. It's something that it just seems to be part of the human experience, what's going on in the Ukraine today. And I just hope that my book, this is the price of war. These lives, these faces, that's the price of war. Does anybody want to ask me any questions? Yes.
Have you been to Europe to see some of the veterans' graves?
Yes, I have. Yes.
So you mentioned that it took a lot of long years of research to put this together. What were some of the local sources that you were able to access to put this together?
Okay, the research I did, this was before all this stuff was online, where you could sit at home on the computer. I had to go down to the University of Windsor. I worked midnights. I'd get off work 7:30 in the morning, and I would go down to the university for 2-3 hours and microfilm. All the newspapers on microfilm. I'd read microfilm. Well, I could only do it for a few hours because my eyes would start falling out. And that's where I've got all the newspaper articles. Then in later years, the National Archives of Canada has all the attestation papers when they signed up. A lot of valuable information there. And that's firsthand research when you start getting into the archives. Veterans Affairs has a remembrance page, and the neat thing about that is that family members are allowed to send in pictures And that's where I got a lot of the pictures because, you know, their families have these pictures, but they're not well known. And, you know, that's where I would have got it. A family member sent that picture, and that's how I got yours.
Oh,
Picture of
okay.
it's on the Veterans Affairs, one of your
Yeah.
family members.
My son sent those pictures in.
Yeah, and that's where I got that from. What's your name?
Irene Hawkins.
Irene's husband's grandfather's in the book.
Page 26 if you have the book.
And to date, I've major undertaking. I was so worried I was going to miss somebody, and it's very possible I did miss somebody. I've probably had 20, 30 people call me, is so-and-so in that book? And yeah, he's in there. So nobody stumped me yet. So, yes.
I had my grandfather that was born in Hesler, and he was all set to go into the service. And he passed away from pneumonia, but I was able, through the archive library, like family history, to get his draft card from when he went in, and also its picture. Now, I don't know if that's something that they could use if it's
Well,
at that, or if it's more pictures or that type of thing.
was he a veteran at the time when he passed
Yes,
away? Yes, he
yes,
was.
He
Is
was
his book in?
classified as a veteran.
Is
Yes,
his
they
name
buried
in-
him as, Gervin Bates.
Bates.
Yeah, Gervin. Yeah.
If he was a
Yeah,
veteran,
yeah.
check to see if his name is in the Book of Remembrance. The Book of Remembrance is it's a book in the Peace Tower in Ottawa, and they turn a page every day. It's got the names of every Canadian that was killed, right from Confederation to
Because he was
Afghanistan.
buried as a veteran.
You'd have to check to see if his name's there, and you can go there online and check.
Okay.
And that's where I'd start. And
They'll even tell you what day the page is on display of your family member.
no, just that.
No, they did, because when I
Oh, they do.
when I wrote, and I got a photocopy of the page of Paul's grandfather, they sent me a letter and said, if you come to Ottawa, March 14th, you will see his page on display.
Oh, isn't that nice?
Yeah. But the weather in March is just not good with Ottawa.
And then I lost several friends in the States through the Afghanistan war. And then one came back with post-traumatic, and he ended up killing
You know,
himself.
The soldiers in the First and Second World War, there wasn't the psychological service that are available today, but they had associations of veterans that got together and talked about their war experiences, and that was the best therapy.
Well, that's the Legion.
The Legion was, and there were other organizations. There was
That comes to mind, the Legion.
the Legion is one. It grew into today's Legion, and that's how it started. Was they get together and talk. They needed to share with one another. After the Boer War, there was a South African Veteran Association. All they did was get together and share, and that was their therapy. For they didn't have a name then, but that was their therapy. Any other questions? Yes.
Oh, Gene? Yeah, my grandfather was in the First World War, in the, I forgot, the Pioneers from Wellington, and then they changed into another battalion when they got there or something, but they were trained in New Brunswick. But he just on the lighter side, if there can be one, he was in a subgroup of the dumbbells, because there was quite a few groups that entertained the troops, and he stayed on for a year after doing that in Europe. There was a little write-up in the Ford Motor Company Gazette from Windsor about him back then. It didn't get into a lot of detail or that, but I guess they interviewed him at the time when he retired in 1957.
Okay.
And my other grandfather on my father's side, he was in the Boer War, but he was in the British Army because he hadn't settled in Canada quite then. He settled about 1906 or something. I think he came to Canada out west.
Now, these veterans, they had a sense of humor. There was one picture in the book, and it was a young Windsor soldier. It was Adolf Hitler's birthday, and they were going on a bombing run for Berlin. They had a bomb. Happy birthday, Adolf, and they had ribbons on it, a bow, and they must have laughed so hard when they saw this. And during the first, I want to tell you another story about a young man from Windsor, and he was a pilot, and he had a crew. There was, I believe, usually 6 or 7 crewmen in a Lancaster bomber. And he was a pilot, and he got married over in England to an English girl, and the wedding party was his flight crew. His best man was his co-pilot, and the bomber, navigator, gunners were all part of the wedding party, and they had a great time. A week later, they went out on a bombing run over Germany, and they were all killed. And they're all buried together. The crash was so horrific that there were just body parts, and they buried them in a communal grave together. So I hope none of you have nightmares tonight over some of these stories. That's not why I'm sharing it with you.
First of all, thank you, this is marvelous. I have to buy those books. Secondly, my grandmother's first cousin, we're talking 1900, volunteered and went to the Boer War. I have 2 pictures. I have a little bit of information. I've got my card.
What's the name?
Ernest Dolman.
Yes,
Dolman.
he's in the book I'm writing.
Good.
He became a doctor in Detroit.
In Detroit, yeah, yes, I've got
So
his
I am aware of him. And if you have, I do have a picture of him because. Have you ever seen the picture? It's in the museum of them standing in front of a tent. There's about
Yes, he's the
he's the
man
one on the end.
with the pistol on his shoulder.
Yes, it is.
So here's a story on the pistol. I don't know how true this is.
Well, you've got to share this with me because I'll put that in the book because
Well, if you let me talk.
Who can stop you
that's
now?
my job.
Listen to her. She knows me too well. Okay, so my uncle was visiting his grandmother, which would have been this man's mother, grandma, here in Windsor. And he found this big pistol in her house. And so he took it back with him to Newcastle, where he then lived. And Dolman had brought the pistol for whatever reason from Detroit to Windsor and left it here because he didn't want to cross the border with a big pistol in the evening. It's safer to take things over during the day. So he was pissed off that his pistol was gone. So grandmother had to call her grandson, my uncle, to bring the pistol back from Newcastle to Windsor because Dolman wants his pistol back. And it might be the same pistol that's in that holster because it's a big
pistol.
was an army-sized pistol. That's me. So you message me and I've
Ernest
got
Dolman, yeah.
Okay, so that's my grandmother's first cousin.
Okay, well, thank
There's
you very
research
much.
everywhere. Everyone knows something.
Thank you for
Sure.
listening to me this evening. And
Thank you.
Thank you on behalf of the volunteer group. This is a token of appreciation. Thank you very much for talking today. I'm going to grab some refreshments, some cookies and snacks. In the meantime, if you have any other questions or you'd like to purchase a book, I think James needs to grab the next few minutes.